So I'll just start out first by just saying hi to everybody. I'm Kate. I'm the readings coordinator here. I'm also your host for tonight's event. So welcome virtually to Elliott Bay Book Company. We're Zooming from the traditional unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Duwamish. On behalf of my colleague, Anna, who is behind the scenes, and you'll see her in the chat box, and the rest of the staff here at Elliott Bay, we really appreciate everyone for tuning in to this program. Tonight, we virtually welcome two journalists and authors, Katherine Corcoran and Alfredo Corchado, here to discuss the former's new book, In the Mouth of the Wolf, A Murder, a Cover-Up, and the True Cost of Silencing the Press. The book just came out, and in a review that was published yesterday, NPR called it epic and a deeply reported and riveting account. After I introduce tonight's guests, Katherine's going to give a short reading, and then she and Alfredo will chat for a while, and then we'll open up to audience questions for the last 10 or 15 minutes. So we just ask that the audience help us stay organized by posting your questions in the Q&A and then your comments in the chat box. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guests tonight, starting with our moderator. Alfredo Corchado is the Mexico border correspondent for the Dallas Morning News, and he's the author of Midnight in Mexico, A Reporter's Journey Through a Country's Descent into Darkness, as well as Homelands, 4 Friends, 2 Countries, and the Fate of the Great Mexican-American Migration. He is a Neiman Lannon, U.S. Mex, Woodrow Wilson, and Rockefeller Fellow, and the winner of the Maria Moore's Cabot Prize and the Elijah Parrish Lovejoy Award for Courage in Journalism. Alfredo lives in Mexico City, but calls the border home. And then our guest of honor tonight is Katherine Corcoran, a former Associated Press bureau chief for Mexico and Central America. She has been an Alicia Patterson Fellow, the Hewlett Fellow for Public Policy at the Kellogg Institute at the University of Notre Dame, and a Logan Nonfiction Program Fellow. At the AP, she led an award-winning team that broke major stories about cartel and state violence and abuse of authority in Mexico and Central America. Her columns about Mexican politics and press freedom have appeared in the Washington Post, the Houston Chronicle, and Univision Online, among other publications. She is currently co-director of Cronkite Noticias, the bilingual reporting program at Arizona State University's Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication, and of Master Lab, an investigative editor training program in Mexico City. So please join me in virtually welcoming Katherine and Alfredo.
Well, thank you, Kate, and thank you, Elliott Bay, for your past support in supporting journalists and writers and authors. And it is a real pleasure and an honor to introduce Katherine, but we know her in Mexico City. I think on both sides of the border, know her as Kathy, Katherine Corcoran. And you're getting some amazing, incredible reviews, Kathy. It's every author's dream. But before we talk about the book, I thought maybe you can set up the narrative by reading the part and introduce us to Regina Martinez and who she was.
Okay, thank you, Alfredo. First, I want to thank Elliott Bay and Kate for inviting me to this event. And I want to thank my longtime friend and esteemed colleague, Alfredo, for being the moderator. And thank you all for coming and being there. I see a lot of good friends out there, both from the US and Mexico. So thank you all for being here. I'm going to start by reading a little bit of the preface to the book, which really sets up the whole reason that I decided to write this story. On my first day as Associated Press bureau chief in Mexico City, I was awakened by a 6 a.m. phone call. The news agency had received a threat from a drug cartel. It came via cell phone text to one of our journalists, ordering us to publish a story about then President Felipe Calderón protecting Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, the world's most notorious drug lord, now serving a life sentence in the United States. Or we would receive a, quote, special visit, The message listed the address of the bureau. It was signed by the Zetas, El Chapo's rivals. One of my responsibilities as bureau chief was the safety of more than a dozen correspondents and 20 freelancers around the region. At that moment, I was faced with protecting the entire Mexico team of a US-based international news agency. The Zetas knew where we worked. In a flurry of messages from AP offices in New York, Buenos Aires, and London, I told my editors that we needed to take extreme actions to the point of removing from the country anyone in danger. I wrote this at 6:47 a.m. These guys don't fool around. Welcome to your first assignment as bureau chief, the Latin America editor told me. I can't say I was surprised. In fact, I knew immediately what to do. I had already worked in Mexico for 2.5 years, and I knew the press there was under siege. It was the most dangerous country in the world to be a journalist outside of a war zone. The forces that attacked the Mexican press usually left the international media alone, but this was an epidemic, and it was only a matter of time before it reached us. By the time we received the threat, 51 journalists had been killed in Mexico since the Committee to Protect Journalists started keeping track in 1992. About half those killings had occurred since I arrived in Mexico in 2008. 10 were killed in 2010 alone, the year I got the early morning phone call. The same week, a Mexican news photographer was gunned down in Ciudad Juarez, across the border from El Paso, Texas. He was the second journalist killed at the local newspaper, El Diario de Juarez, in as many years. The first, assassinated in 2008, covered justice and organized crime and was far more in the crosshairs. But the photographer who was killed in 2010 was just 21 years old. An 18-year-old photo intern traveling with him was injured in the attack. What did anyone gain by attacking them? To the newspaper, its staff had become cannon fodder. That Sunday, the paper ran a headline and a front page editorial addressed to the narcos. What do you want from us? The Diario de Juarez front page editorial was the first major public acknowledgement of just how bad things had gotten, especially for journalists at news organizations along the Mexican-US border, where drug cartels were in fierce confrontations over shipping routes. Up to that point, editors refused to talk if their newsrooms were hit, under the illusion that silence would buy them safety. Now the newspaper flat out identified the drug cartels as the de facto authorities. What do you want from us played around the world, as far as Japan and Russia, but particularly in the United States, where it garnered a New York Times editorial and networks calling my office looking for correspondents to interview. A week into my new job, I was thick into the issue that would dominate my time there. Pedro Torres, editor of El Diario de Juarez, who wrote the headline, told me that his question, which everyone took literally as supplicating to the narcos, was in fact rhetorical. We weren't speaking directly to drug gangs. It was an open message, Torres said in an interview. We wanted to provoke a reaction that would call attention to what's happening in Juarez. And in the end, I think we met our objective. Except that despite the global publicity, nothing changed. No one has ever been detained for the photographer's murder. One trigger man was sentenced to 30 years in the 2008 reporter killing, but whoever ordered the hit was never identified. Instead of pursuing the killers, Mexican officials had a way of blaming the victims, implying that if they were killed, they must have fallen into malos pasos, bad ways. Then one journalist killing changed the narrative. On April 28, 2012, Regina Martinez, correspondent for the national investigative magazine Proceso, was discovered beaten to death in her bathroom in Jalapa, the capital of the Gulf state of Veracruz. Her death made news around the world. In a state known for corruption, Regina was the author of many exclusives, and no one could argue that she was dirty, nor could they argue that it was a cartel hit. Regina covered government. Even so, people who knew her or who worked with her or who were family members refused to speak publicly about the case, clearly out of fear. In effect, they were unwittingly helping those who wanted to obscure the facts. Within a year, authorities arrested an alleged suspect and declared the case closed. It was closed for no one but the Veracruz government. The case lingered in my mind as well, even as I managed one of the busiest news regions for the AP at the time. Perhaps it was because Regina and I were of the same generation and spent our entire adult lives as journalists. Perhaps because I talked to her on the phone once. Perhaps because her story revealed what was really happening with these journalist killings. In the face of rampant corruption, which was crippling Mexico's new democracy, they were an attempt to shut down free speech, and they worked.
Beautiful. Thank you, Kathy. So this is what we're going to do. Spend the next 20, 25 minutes discussion with Kathy, and then we love to hear questions. Kathy, Regina was a correspondent for Proceso, as you read. How does Regina fit or doesn't fit the profile of journalists in Mexico? As you said, Mexico is one of the most dangerous places to practice journalism. How do other journalists fit that profile?
Well, I would say for her time, she was very much ahead. She was an independent, digging, tenacious reporter at a time. She started her career in the 1980s. At a time when much of the press in Mexico was still co-opted by the government. Mexico was still under one-party rule, authoritarian rule, and most of the press just went along with the government official story, and they didn't cover a lot of things, the things the government didn't want people to know. And so when she started her career, she was a person who didn't buy the official story. She went out in the street, she asked questions, she went to far corners of the state to cover land disputes and conflicts with the government, military abuse. She checked documents, she checked her facts, she didn't just print hearsay. So her standards were very high and also unique for that time, especially out in the States. The Mexican press in Mexico City became much more professional and much more independent and critical earlier. But for the press in the outlying states, it stayed pretty much the status quo that it had been for decades. And so she really stood out at the time as a reporter who did things differently and covered communities that didn't have a voice, like indigenous communities, laborers, farm workers, women. And so in that sense, she found a lot of stories that nobody else wanted covered, frankly. Now, I would say today there are a lot more reporters in Mexico of that profile. And they are out in the outlying states, not just in Mexico City. And they are under grave danger because they do not have backup. They do not have a working justice system. They don't have, there aren't consequences for these attacks for the most part. And so you have more reporters who are trained to dig and be independent and uncover real stuff. And but the system to protect them has not changed in any way at all. And so as you see, the numbers are actually going up, unfortunately.
I mean, to put it in context, there's been more than 100 journalists killed since 2000. That's when Vicente Fox became president, the first opposition president in Mexican history. And I think we're on par this year. I mean, 12, 13 journalists already killed in 2022, 95, 96 impunity rate. Talk about just how vulnerable are these our colleagues in Mexico?
Well, I think, I mean, they're very vulnerable, and the reasons being that for a long time, the tradition of the media, again, because they tended to be aligned with the government, um, they don't have protocols for security in their newsrooms.
I mean, give
For a
us a
long
sense,
time,
for example, give us a sense that the wages, do they have healthcare benefits? Do they have security training? Give us that sense of who are they, and why are they so easily killed, and you have this remaining impunity across Mexico?
well, as you mentioned, they earned very low salaries. In the provinces, you might earn $500 a month. $500 a month would actually be considered a good salary. $1,000 a month would be a huge salary. So they're paid very poorly. They don't get benefits in many cases because the media, to save money, will hire them as contractors, and they don't pay benefits. And some of these people are even paid per story. So they're paid as little as $5 or $10 for the stories that they're writing. And so, and because they have, in many cases, an arm's length relationship with the newspaper, they have no security. And initially, when this was happening back in 2010, when I started this story, if a reporter was killed, the reaction of the media was to distance themselves from the person and to say, well, they weren't working on that, with our permission, or we didn't know anything about it, or they're not really staff members. And so they're actually out there operating entirely on their own. And with no backup from their media. Again, I think some things have changed in recent years. No backup from their media and no backup from their peers, because their peers are afraid, or their peers are colluding. And another big factor, especially with the lower paid journalists, is they need to have several jobs to make ends meet. So they often work for other media, more than one media, but then they also do other things. Sometimes they work for the government. Sometimes they work for, they're very susceptible to taking money because they can't make a living on their journalist salaries. And so with that kind of situation, there's a lot of distrust among the reporters who consider themselves real reporters, independent, not co-opted. And so there's not a lot of solidarity inside the profession. So basically, when you're a reporter and you decide to go out and investigate something sensitive, you are completely on your own.
Give us a sense of the backstory. I mean, you spent 10 years following the story, more than 10 years following the story, the majority of that time reporting this book. What kept you going? Give us a sense of the risk that you encounter, and how did you protect your own sources, many of them reporters themselves?
Well, as I said, the story just lived in my head for a while before I started working on it. And I started working on it in 2015, so 3 years after she died. And I felt that the time was in my favor, because when this happened, it was so sensitive. Nobody would talk about this case. And if you went out there and started asking questions, it was a very dangerous thing to do early on after the killing. And some reporters and the representative from the Committee to Protect Journalists who did go out early received some very unusual treatment to messages to say they were being watched.
Can you give us an example?
Well, yes. So the late Mike O'Connor, who then represented Mexico for the Committee to Protect Journalists, went out to investigate the murder on the part of the CPJ, which does that work. They investigate and they record these murders. And when he was there, someone entered his room in the middle of the night while he was sleeping and put a box of chocolates in the drawer where he had his reporter notebook. And so it was just a very, again, for international people or foreign correspondents, they wouldn't pull up and gun you down like they would the local journalists, but they would give you a message that you better be careful, that you're being watched, and that it might be a good idea for you to leave. So that was one incident. Other incidents of journalists from Mexico City going out to investigate, they also received threats. There's the story of Jorge Carrasco, who was charged by Proceso of investigating the murder, and he wrote all the holes in the government story and the cover-up, and he received a threat where he had to leave the country. So this was just incredibly sensitive, and I thought when I finally had the space to start working on this, I thought, okay, 3 years have passed, things probably settled down, maybe people want to talk. It was not like that at all. It was still very much under wraps, and it was very sensitive and dangerous for people to talk to me. So I discovered very early on that rather than feeling any threats to me, I was most concerned about the threats against the people who agreed to talk to me. And so a real big part of this exercise and this project was to figure out ways for me to stay under the radar and for me to protect the people who were talking to me, because they were the ones who were taking the big risk.
Give us an idea. I mean, what kinds of things that you do to mitigate the risks that you face, and then how did you help your colleagues? I mean, how did you protect them?
Well, I tried to be very much under the radar when I went out there. I just took buses and taxis and tried to blend in as much as I could. I registered in hotels under different names. I bought bus tickets under different names. I carried cash so there wouldn't be any record of my credit card in the ATMs. At that time, the government was very heavily monitoring journalists and the state government. And so I had to be careful with my phone. I had to put it in one of those microwave envelopes that would block the signal. I did all of those kinds of things. And what I did was I usually interviewed people at my hotel. So they would come and we wouldn't be out in a public place, but sometimes I actually had to pay for them to leave, and I would interview them other places, like in Mexico City, because it was so dangerous for them to be, any chance that they could be seen with me. And the other thing is I couldn't tell anyone else who I was talking to. And you know, Alfredo, that's reporting. You get information and then you check it with other people and you say, well, so-and-so says this. And, you try to kind of get a consensus of what was going on or who the reliable sources are. And I couldn't do any of that. I couldn't tell anybody who I was talking to because I didn't want to expose them. And so that was very difficult because it hampered my ability to really cross information and check information.
Yeah, no, I know you were extremely quiet. You wouldn't share anything with any of us as colleagues, as foreign correspondents, maybe one or two there. But did you feel like you faced any dangers in your reporting? Can you talk about some of those obstacles? Were there any threats against your life, for example?
No, there were never threats against my life. I did get a message like the box of chocolates that I felt was telling me that I was being watched. And it was an odd situation where I was interviewing a person in a restaurant, but we weren't really talking about anything sensitive. She was a college friend of Regina's, and I wanted to find out what Regina was like in college. And so we sat there for a while and she told me fun stories about her and when they first got their first jobs, et cetera. And that was it. And then when I was leaving, a man approached me And I had heard from everyone there, all the reporters there, that you have to be careful of the people who are spying on you and watching you, the orejas, as they call them, ears. And so a man approached me and he looked very professorly, and he said, and he was an older man, and he said, I couldn't help it over here. Are you a professor? And I said, yes, I'm just, interested in politics in Jalapa. And I was at a university at the time, so I used that university. And he said, well, maybe I can help you, because I was a diplomat for a long time. I know a lot about Veracruz politics. And so probably my mistake, but it's a habit with reporters. You do give people your phone number because maybe he could help me. So I gave him my phone number, but then I never really called him and he never called me. And then on Christmas Day, this was a couple months later, he called me, and I was in the United States, and I saw a number from Jalapa that I didn't recognize. So I decided to answer it, because I'm a reporter, in case somebody had something for me. And he told me and I kind of forgotten about him, and he told me who he was, and he said, I just wanted to call and wish you a Merry Christmas. And it was very odd, and also a very personal day. I was with my family. You don't call people on Christmas unless you really know them. And it was one of those things, like a box of chocolates. I mean, there are things like that where there'll be what could be considered niceties, but they have a very odd, kind of creepy feeling behind them. So I did that did happen to me. I really tried to wait till the very end to talk to all the officials, because I felt like once the officials knew what I was working on, my cover was blown. And then I had to really change my tactic once they knew I was there asking questions. I couldn't stay as long. I used burner phones. I used a lot of different things. I used I closed all my social media accounts. Things like that. So I know, but really, I was more worried. One of my sources at one point was being followed, and it was a very scary situation. And in another case, a source got a phone call saying, we know you're talking to an American reporter. And this is years after this happened. So obviously there's something there that people still want to keep covered up.
Before we go into lessons learned for the US and for the world, just tell us a little more about Regina. We know her as the journalist who worked for Proceso, who was murdered, but tell us, what was she like as a person? I mean, you spent a lot of time talking to people around her, close colleagues.
Well, as I said, she was ahead of her time professionally as a reporter. She was very serious. She was very private about anything outside of her work, and even about her work. She didn't want to share anything that she was working on. But the most people described her as brava. She was very outspoken. She was very strong. She was a person of very small stature. She was of indigenous roots. And again, she wasn't the profile at the time of someone who would become a reporter, much less a very aggressive and outspoken and tough reporter. And so she had this reputation that kind of made it actually rubbed a lot of officials the wrong way, but also she had a little fan club, because people were accustomed to seeing a woman behave that way. And so these years later, when I was talking to people, and journalism was mostly men at the time, overwhelmingly men. And so I talked to these men who worked with her, and every time they talked about her, they laughed, like in a very affectionate way, about how she would just take press releases and throw them in the trash and say, "Pinche propaganda." and the way that she would call the, you know, she would call officials criminals, and she would fight for her stories and argue and say, why did you cut that out of my story? And they had a lot of stories that they would tell about how she just was like this explosion of energy from this tiny person. And they still, when they remember her, they just laugh affectionately because she was such a standout. But she was also, I mean, in the Mexican tradition, she was also very polite with her sources. She was very formal. She had doors slammed in her face. She was barred from press conferences. She was barred from getting press releases. She was very conscious of her own security. She never went home by herself after an event. She always wanted someone to accompany her till she got to her house. She hardly ever let anyone into her home, even her friends. Some of her closest friends had never been inside of her home. She kind of closed herself in on the weekends to work, and she didn't want anyone to know anything about her personal life or her family because they could be potential targets for people who wanted to make her life uncomfortable or do some kind of retribution for her stories.
Just a reminder, we have about 10 minutes, so get your questions in. Kathy, you spent, again, I keep harping about how much time you've been following the story, but what are you hoping that that Mexico can learn from this? I mean, it's a story based in Jalapa, in Veracruz, and you do an incredible job of describing the state, the politics. But beyond Mexico, beyond Veracruz, what are the lessons to be learned?
Well, I wanted to write this story because for several reasons. First of all, just to find out what happened because somebody got away with murder. But I also thought, you know, there's this problem, this epidemic of journalist killings, and it's not getting better, it's getting worse. And I thought, if I could just, as a foreigner, as an American, if I could just write this for a wider audience, if I could just bring light, which is what journalists do, just bring light to the issue, maybe there would be something, you know, some idea, somebody could come forward in the case, or somebody could figure out a way to actually help and provide backup so that these journalists can do their jobs. So that's kind of what I started out with. But as time went on, I started to see attacks on journalists in my own country in a way that you and I never saw in our entire careers. And we've been at it for a long time. And so I started to want to show a picture of what happens in a society when you can successfully silence the press, because that's what happened in Veracruz. Veracruz had what I call in the book a criminal government. The government itself was running criminal enterprises, and they were behind some of these journalist killings, although we couldn't know for sure.
Can you hold up? Can explain that a little more? Running a criminal organization, how elaborate on that?
Well, it was a morph with the arrival of democracy in Mexico. Mexico was ruled for 71 years by a single party authoritarian rule. And once that broke down and there were real democratic elections, the centralized power of the old system fell apart. So before the president controlled everything in the country, including the organized crime. And then when the power decentralized, so did the organized crime groups. They had to make deals with governors, mayors, local politicians to get their goods and to do their business. And what happened was the governments as well were no longer ruled by a strong hand from this, you know, from Mexico City, and they had a lot of regional power as well. And so what happened was these groups between the government and the organized crime, they started creating various relationships that didn't exist before. For example, some would be sort of like, well, we'll leave you alone if you leave us alone, or some would be like, well, you know, we're going to work together, because people were making enormous amounts of money from drugs, from people smuggling, all kinds of things that were going on, and the politicians wanted in on that. And also, they needed money to run elections or run campaigns now, because there were several parties fighting in every cycle for a seat. So the narcos had the money, the politicians had the territory, and they started making various deals. But in some ways, the deals morphed into the fact that the government themselves became the criminal enterprise. And that happened in Veracruz, and you could use all the powers of the state, the police, the justice system, the public treasury, to run your enterprise. And that's what they did. The police became like death squads. The police worked for narcos, the police. And so you had this system where, in order to run it with impunity, you couldn't have reporters there digging in and reporting all this stuff. And so after Regina was killed, because everyone knew when Regina was killed that it was a killing to silence her.
So you're talking about, you were making the point about you're living in an era where suddenly in the United States you have attacks against the press, charges of fake news, and you're covering the Regina case. I mean, how do those two events come together? How do they influence you? How do they inspire you?
Well, I was hearing in Mexico, the journalists who were being killed were corrupt. They were working for the narcos. They weren't real journalists. And so there was a campaign to discredit any journalist who was breaking out of the mold, who was trying to do real reporting. And so, and it was very effective, because there were no investigations. And I remember the president's office called me at one point and said to me, Kathy, they're not journalists. I mean, the campaign was so deliberate. And then my colleagues as foreign correspondents would say the same thing. Oh, they're not journalists. And so there was a very successful silencing and discrediting of the press, and it allowed this criminal government to operate with impunity. And the ultimate victims of that, and I think this is something really important that people need to understand, the journalists are just the first line of attack. It's not about us. It's about the citizenry. It's about controlling the citizenry and controlling what the citizens know, so that these people can operate with impunity. It's a message of control of you and everybody, not the journalists. And so when I started hearing those messages in the United States, the press is corrupt, the press makes things up, the press is the enemy of the people. The good press, which we never heard ever in our careers, the good press was the press that supported the agenda of the president. I couldn't help but think of Mexico and say, you know, if you start on that road, this is where it ends up. And so that's how the story that I was reporting became relevant in the United States, because we are in this erosion with the distrust of independent journalism, reported journalism, facts. And if we go down that road, it can be a really scary place, because it's a message of control. And so my final reason for writing this book was to try to open up this discussion and say, really, is this what we want in our society? Is this where we want to go as a society, in this shutting down of the press?
As a professor, what do you tell young journalists? I mean, all these attacks against journalists, I think, have had an impact. I mean, it's not, at least when I talk to younger people, they say, look, the wages are terrible. The reputation is bad. I'm not sure I want to be a journalist. What do you tell them? What's your message to them?
Well, I think the people I work with, the students I work with, um, they're they're actually, most of them are really on board. They're really excited about becoming journalists. Um, I know that some who are very good journalists, student journalists, say, "Well, I'm not sure I really want to go into journalism. Maybe I'll do public relations or something else." With those people, I say, first of all, I encourage them. I say, "You're very good at this. You should keep at it." So I tell them that. And second of all, I tell them that it's more important than ever that we have people like them going into the profession. We need young people. We need young energy. We need people who grew up in the modern social media world and who, are intuitive with all the new kinds of information. And we need people who are well trained and who care about telling good stories. It's more important than ever. And so I just try to say that, I've made a whole career of it, and I still never tire of what I'm doing. It's always interesting. I'm always learning. And I just say that it's really more important than ever to the democracy that we have, that we feed our profession with young, energetic, educated, tenacious people. So I just try to get that message out as much as possible.
We have a first question from John Diaz, who says, "This is a fascinating read and a remarkable example of journalistic persistence. Do you intend to continue to pursue this until Regina's killers are ultimately brought to justice?"
I kind of, I think I uncovered a new line of investigation in the book. So I kind of want to see what the reaction is to that, frankly, and go from there.
Without giving the end away, I mean, how close do you think you got to the truth?
I think that, like I said, I think I opened a new line of investigation. I think one of the
Can you
problems.
elaborate on that? I mean, what do you mean by that?
Well, I found some information that hadn't been reported before about why someone might have a motive to silence her, and I think part of the reason this case is kind of dead in the water is because there aren't any new angles. And so I think that with this new information, I just want to see what happens now that it's out in the public, and kind of go from there.
Another question from our esteemed colleague, Mary Beth Sheridan from the Washington Post and the new Cabot winner. What were some of the biggest challenges in reporting out this mystery, beyond trying to protect your sources?
Well, I think it was finding out what's true. And I try to portray that in the book, that it was so difficult. There's nothing simple about anything in Mexico, and probably in all reporting everywhere, but there were no yes or no answers. And so I would be going down a path and thinking I was really developing a good, base of information and a conclusion, and then somebody would say something that just threw a bomb into it. And so it's just being in this place where people are so afraid to tell the truth, and some people don't want you to know the truth, so they do all kinds of things to lead you off the path. And so to try to do a piece of journalism in that environment where you do have things fact checked and documents to back things up and 3 or 4 different sources to back things up, that was extremely difficult in this kind of environment. I just remember, you know, we know as reporters, what we like to do is we like to establish relationships with people. So there's trust. And that involves, you know, spending time with them and going back to them and explaining a lot about what you're doing and all that kind of thing. And to a T, in these cases, I would do these interviews, and they would, at the end of the interview, they would say, I never talk to you, never come back here again.
Wow.
And that was a completely different environment that I was used than what I was used to working in.
At the AP and other media organizations. This question is from another esteemed colleague, Elizabeth Malkin. Her question is, the voice of media owners and editors has been silent in Mexico regarding the murders of journalists. What would be the best way to push them to use their influence?
I think, again, it's difficult because a lot of, and again, this is changing, the generations are changing, but a lot of the owners or the top editors grew up in the old system. And so they still think of, you know, you don't rock the boat too much, even though they're reporters, they're younger reporters and their younger editors want to do it. And so a lot of times stories get killed that they feel will make too much trouble for them. I think it's, on the one hand, it's a generational issue that maybe as these younger reporters take on more leadership roles. And also, well, there's actually a strong traditional connection between media and the government that has gone away, which is the government used to give these media companies a lot of money to survive. And so I think you see a lot more aggressiveness and independence now that the media aren't relying on this money, that a lot of times they just wanted to follow the status quo so they didn't have their funds cut off. That whole equation has changed to the point where newspapers and television stations, whether they like it or not, have been cut off. So that leads to more independence. And also there are groups inside of Mexico that are training editors, I'm involved in one of them, to be more leaders in the independence of their media and their teams, and to establish safety protocols and to be backups to their teams that are going out and finding these stories. And these are kind of mid-level editors who are sort of mid-career that we're hoping will carry that on as they go up the ladder in their organizations, that idea of they're the leaders in terms of ethics, safety, standards, fact-checking for their newsrooms. And the more work we can do in that regard, I think the more change we'll see.
I think these last two questions are similar topic. One is, and I think you kind of answered this with the last answer, but where is the hope in Mexico? Is there hope in Mexico? And dovetails with the September data hack of Mexico's Ministry of Defense, the alleged links between the ruling political party, the military, and organized crime. Are things getting better or worse in Mexico, especially under President López Obrador?
I'd like to hear your answer to that, Alfredo. But first, I'll take a stab at it. When times are tough, I do think there are a lot of problems right now inside Mexico. I think there is rampant corruption. I do not see a political leader that wants to try something radically different or to strengthen the institutions that could stand up to that kind of crime and malfeasance. So in that sense, I think I'm a little pessimistic, but I'm very optimistic about the media because I see the media is becoming more and more independent. There are more and more, I mean, I meet journalists there all the time, and there are more and more journalists who really care about telling good stories and finding the truth. And to me, when the system is going bad, that makes the journalism all the more important. And so that's something that gives me hope, is that the standards, the independence, the watchdog nature of the press has improved dramatically in Mexico, and there are some support systems to help that flourish. I think we need more solidarity between journalists in Mexico and the United States and other groups, so that we can also give them support and backup, and we can make noise about these crimes, because these crimes are intended to make silence, and we need to figure out some way to make them very uncomfortable for the people who want to commit them. Right now, that's not the justice system, because there's impunity, and there's a high, 95, 96% of cases go uninvestigated or and so what I say is, we need to find a way to make noise so that these people will think twice and think that committing these crimes would actually be more of a detriment.
I think In the Mouth of the Wolf is a great way to maybe bring journalists from both countries together. Maybe one of our colleagues in Mexico City is planning a launch party or something, and it's beyond a launch party, but just have that communication, have that camaraderie and sense of solidarity. There's one more question that came from, I think it's Carrie Khan, Michoacan. She says, can you elaborate? Carrie Khan it's with NPR now in Brazil, the South America bureau chief. Can you elaborate on the criminal enterprise that the government of Veracruz was involved in your reporting, that you were able to find evidence, these enterprises that the Mexican government is pursuing, especially in the current case against the former governor of Veracruz, Javier Duarte?
Well, the governor who ran this criminal enterprise for 6 years is now in prison. He was convicted of money laundering and malfeasance. It's unknown exactly how much money he stole, but starting with the first question, it's what they basically did was they stole a whole lot of public money, and that's a criminal enterprise. I mean, it was a big one. They took a lot of money, but they also collaborated with other criminal organizations in terms of using their positions to help the criminals sell their goods or transport their goods, using police to help, there was a war between two cartels at the time in Veracruz. So the government took one side and used police to fight the other cartel, but on behalf of the cartel they were aligned with. They were disappearing their enemies. They were disappearing people they thought were with the rival cartel, whether they were or not. There are thousands of disappeared in Veracruz. There are discovering mass graves all the time, and very few of those people have been identified, unfortunately, to this day. They were using their power to make money, basically, and launder money. And sometimes it was state money, but sometimes it was criminal money that they were receiving for allowing these criminal organizations to operate. Like, I think there was a testimony once where they said they paid the state, a narco said they paid the state police something like $1 million a month or something like that. And so there were all these agreements and ways to keep, like, if you complained or called the police, you were the person who was harassed. or you disappeared. And so it was basically an all-out attack on the citizenry that they were elected to represent and protect. And I think Javier Duarte, you know, he's in prison, he was prosecuted, but he had a whole team of people who are just out there walking around free. There were cases made against them, but they weren't very strong cases, and they eventually got thrown out. And these people have very good lawyers, and so there's a whole lot of people walking around that did a whole lot of stuff and are not in prison. Did that answer the question? I think there were some other elements you wanted me to speak to.
We're about out of time, but I mean, congratulations on the book, and want to remind everyone to please pick up a book from the local bookstore, Elliott Bay, or other bookstores across the country. Kathy, any plans to translate this book into Spanish and get it into Mexico and beyond, Latin America?
Yes, definitely, but we're gonna that'll be down the road. Hopefully it'll be translated into several languages.
Right. Okay.
Well, I just want to say thank you again, Alfredo, and thank you, Kathy, both for your really insightful conversation that you had tonight, and then also just for the really important work that you're doing out there. I also thank everyone who tuned in tonight and asked such great questions. This was a really wonderful conversation to get to witness. And I hope everybody here runs out and grabs your book, Kathy, In the Mouth of the Wolf. It's available now. You can get it from us online, come to our store, support your local bookstore. And yeah, thanks again, everyone.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks to everyone who participated, and thank you, Alfredo.
Thank you, Kathy, and best of luck. Go sell books.